I have always liked the quiet that comes with camping. Being out there, far from the sound of cars, away from people, away from everything. Just the sound of the wind through the trees, the crunch of dry leaves under my boots, the occasional snap of a twig from some animal passing by. It was something I had done for years. I wasn't an expert survivalist, but I knew how to handle myself. I planned my trips well, brought enough supplies, and never took stupid risks. The last thing I wanted was to be one of those stories on the news. Someone who went out into the woods and never came back. This time, I had picked a remote area in the Pacific Northwest. A friend had mentioned it once. Deep in the mountains, not many people around, a great spot if you wanted to be alone. It wasn't an official campsite. There were no marked trails, no designated fire pits, just open land. Perfect for what I wanted. The drive was long, taking me through winding mountain roads, the kind where if you took a wrong turn, you wouldn't be found for days. I had to check my map constantly, making sure I was still on the right path. Eventually, I reached the spot where I had planned to leave my truck. It was a rough dirt road that ended in a small clearing. From there, I would hike deeper into the woods to set up camp. I grabbed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, some food, my knife, a small hatchet, and a few other essentials. I always carried a gun when I camped, not because I expected trouble, but because I liked knowing I had it if I needed it. The hike in was peaceful. The air smelled like pine, and the only sounds were birds and the rustling of trees. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt, and I liked that. After about an hour, I found a good spot. A small flat clearing near a stream, hidden well between thick trees. Felt safe. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and got everything ready for the night. As the sun started to set, I made a small fire, cooked some food, and sat there, just enjoying the stillness. It was sometime after dark when I noticed something. It was small at first, just a feeling, a shift in the air, the kind of thing you don't really notice until it's too late. Then I saw it off in the trees, maybe 50 yards away. A shape. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a coyote, but it wasn't moving like one. It was standing still, too still. I stared at it for a long time, waiting for it to move to confirm what it was, but it just stood there. I reached for my flashlight and shined it toward the trees. Nothing. Whatever it was gone. I told myself it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. That was normal out here. The shadows from the fire, the way the trees swayed. It made your mind see things that weren't really there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I made sure my gun was close and sat there by the fire, trying to relax. I didn't hear anything. No footsteps, no breaking branches, nothing that would suggest someone was out there, but I couldn't shake it. Eventually, I forced myself to sleep. I woke up to the sound of something outside my tent. It wasn't loud, just a faint crunching sound, like slow, careful steps. I stayed completely still, listening. My hand moved toward my gun. The sound stopped. I held my breath. Then another crunch, closer this time. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. A bear? A mountain lion? No, it was too careful. It was someone. I didn't move. I waited, trying to hear anything else. Silence. Minutes passed. Nothing. Slowly, I reached out and unzipped the tent just enough to see outside. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. The trees were dark shapes against the night sky. I scanned the area. Nothing. I stayed like that for a long time, waiting, watching, but I saw nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself I had imagined it. Maybe a branch had fallen. Maybe an animal had passed through. I closed the tent and lay back down. Sleep didn't come easy after that. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around. Everything was as I had left it, except for one thing: footprints. Not mine. They were fresh, pressed into the damp earth. And they weren't from boots. Bare feet. Someone had been out here, watching. I I felt my stomach drop. I packed up fast. I didn't want to be here any longer than I had to. As I was finishing up, I noticed something else. A small carving on a tree near my camp. It was a crude symbol, a simple X carved deep into the bark. I had been marked. That was enough for me. I grabbed my pack and started moving, keeping my gun in my hand. I wasn't going to wait around to see who had been out there. The hike back to my truck felt longer than before. Every sound made me jump. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch. I was halfway back when I saw them. 3 figures, standing in the trees, far enough that I couldn't make out their faces. Just standing, watching. They didn't move. I gripped my gun tighter and kept walking, forcing myself not to run. The figures stayed where they were, unmoving. I didn't look back again. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back and got in. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I drove faster than I should have, barely slowing down for the rough road. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main highway. Only then did I let out a breath. I never found out who they were. I never went back to that spot. I still camp, but not alone. Never alone. And every time I do, I think about those footprints and the people who left them, marking me, waiting. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe boredom, maybe stupidity, maybe some deep down part of me that just wanted to test myself. But I can tell you now, after everything that happened, that I won't be doing it again. It was early October, the kind of season where the days were short and the nights stretched out long and cold. I had some time off work and decided to take a camping trip. But not just any trip, no, I had an idea that would make it different. I wanted to do something that would make my skin crawl, something that would make me feel alive in a way that my day-to-day life didn't. That's how I found myself driving to an old, abandoned graveyard on the edge of a forest, deep in the middle of nowhere. I had looked it up online. It wasn't a well-known place, just some forgotten burial ground where people used to lay their dead a long time ago before bigger cemeteries took over. The town nearby had mostly emptied out over the years, leaving the graveyard to rot, taken over by weeds and the slow creep of time. No one really went there anymore, and that's exactly what made it perfect. The road leading to the graveyard was barely a road at all. Just dirt and gravel, cracked and full of potholes. Trees lined both sides, tall and skeletal, their bare branches stretching toward the sky. It was about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town, and I didn't pass a single car on the way. By the time I arrived, the sun was already dipping low, washing the sky in deep orange and pink. The entrance to the graveyard was nothing more than a rusted old gate, half open, hanging on by a single hinge. Beyond it, the land stretched out unevenly, covered in crooked tombstones, some fallen over, others cracked and worn down by time. The place smelled damp, like wet leaves and earth that had been undisturbed for years. I parked my car just outside the gate, grabbing my gear. My backpack was packed with the basics: tent, sleeping bag, flashlight, food, and a knife just in case. I wasn't worried about animals, but you never know who or what you might run into in a place like this. I walked past the gate, boots crunching on dead leaves, and took a slow look around. It was silent, not the kind of silence you get in the city, where there's always some distant hum of life, but real silence, heavy and thick, like the world had just stopped moving. No wind, no rustling trees, no birds, just the sound of my own breathing. I found a spot near the back of the graveyard, close to the tree line where the forest began. It felt safer somehow, being near an escape route if I needed one. Setting up camp didn't take long. I pitched my tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, and started a small fire. As the sun disappeared completely, the graveyard changed. In daylight, it had just looked like an old, forgotten place. But at night, with only the glow of my fire, it felt different. The shadows between the tombstones stretched out longer, and the trees in the distance seemed to close in. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was oppressive, pressing down on me, making every little sound seem bigger than it was. I ate quickly, not really enjoying my food, and kept the fire going. I wasn't tired yet, but I didn't feel like moving around much either. Something about this place made me want to stay put, to keep my back to the fire and my eyes on the dark. Hours passed. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath in the firelight. My hands were stiff from the cold. I checked my phone, no signal, not even a single bar. I expected that, but it still made me uneasy. I don't know when I started hearing it. Maybe an hour after midnight. A sound, faint at first, like something shifting in the distance. It wasn't the wind, there was no wind. It wasn't an animal either. It was too steady, too deliberate. A slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled through the dirt. I held my breath, straining my ears. The sound stopped. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, telling myself it was nothing. Probably just my imagination playing tricks on me. Then it started again, closer this time. I reached for my flashlight and flicked it on, sweeping the beam across the graveyard. The stones cast long, twisted shadows, but there was nothing there. Just rows of graves, silent and still. I told myself it was an animal, a raccoon or a stray dog maybe, but the unease didn't go away. I stayed by the fire a while longer, my body tense, my eyes darting to the darkness beyond the tombstones. The sound didn't come back. Eventually, I convinced myself it had just been my nerves. I climbed into my tent, zipping it up tight, and lay on my back, listening. Nothing, just silence again. I closed my eyes, telling myself to sleep. Then something touched my tent. It wasn't a hard hit, just a light pressure, like fingers pressing against the fabric. My body went stiff. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. The pressure stayed for a moment, then slid slowly along the side of the tent before disappearing. I gripped my knife, heart hammering against my ribs. I wanted to unzip the tent and check, but every instinct screamed at me to stay still. I waited, muscles tense, listening to the silence. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. At some point, exhaustion won. I don't know when I fell asleep, but when I woke up, it was still dark. The fire had burned out, leaving only cold ashes. My body was stiff from the cold. I sat up, my breath fogging in the air, and then I saw it. The graves around my tent. They had been disturbed. The dirt at their bases looked fresh, like someone had been digging in the night. Some of the headstones had shifted, tilting forward, as if something underneath had pushed against them. I didn't waste time. I grabbed my bag, stuffed my things inside, and tore down my tent as fast as my frozen fingers would let me. I didn't even bother rolling up my sleeping bag, just shoved it in my pack. I kept my knife in my hand as I moved, my eyes darting around the graveyard. It was still silent, but not in the same way. Before, it had just been quiet. Now it felt like something was watching me. I reached my car, throwing my gear inside, and got in. The engine roared to life, shattering the silence. I hit the gas, tires skidding against the gravel as I sped away. I didn't look back. I don't know who or what was out there that night. I don't want to know, but I do know this. When I checked online later, I found something I hadn't seen before. A police report from years back. Someone had gone missing near that graveyard. A drifter just passing through. The search lasted weeks, but they never found him. And the strangest part? The graves in that cemetery had all been accounted for. Every single one of them. Whoever had been buried there hadn't been missing, which meant whoever had been digging wasn't trying to get in. They were trying to get out. I won't be going back. Ever. It was 2016 when I found myself deep in the Amazon rainforest, miles away from civilization. I wasn't there for research or some expedition, just a personal trip, something I had always wanted to do. I had camped in forests before, hiked mountains alone, and spent nights under the stars in unfamiliar places. But the Amazon was different. It was alive in a way other places weren't. Every inch of it was moving, buzzing, shifting. It was a place that didn't care if you were there or not. I had set up my camp near a river, one of the many twisting veins that carved through the dense jungle. The water was muddy and fast, swollen from recent rains. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of wet earth and rotting vegetation. Every step I took on the forest floor was met with the squelch of damp leaves and the occasional crunch of twigs snapping underfoot. The sun had set hours ago, but the jungle never truly became dark. The sky was choked by thick clouds, and the only light came in quick flashes of lightning, cutting through the blackness like a blade. Rain poured in heavy sheets, drumming against the canopy above and trickling down in cold streams along my tent. I had a small fire going earlier, but the rain had killed it. Now, I sat inside my tent, listening to the storm rage outside. I wasn't scared, not at first. The sounds of the jungle at night were a constant chorus. Insects hummed in an endless drone, frogs croaked from the riverbank, and distant cries of unseen animals echoed through the trees. It was the kind of noise that should have been comforting signs that the world outside was still moving, still alive. But something felt off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on right away, just a creeping unease that settled in my chest. It started with the silence. One moment the jungle was alive, the next it wasn't. The insects stopped buzzing. The frogs fell silent. Even the river, though still moving, seemed quieter somehow. It was like the entire rainforest had paused, holding its breath. I sat up, my heart hammering against my ribs. I strained my ears, trying to catch any sound, any movement. Then something moved outside my tent. It was faint, just the soft crunch of wet leaves shifting underfoot. But I knew that sound. It wasn't the rain. It wasn't the wind. It was footsteps. I reached for my flashlight, clicking it on. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating the thin walls of my tent. Shadows danced across the fabric as the rain slid down the sides in heavy streaks. I held my breath, waiting. Another step, closer this time. I turned off the flashlight. The tent was too thin, too weak to hide in if something or someone was out there. I needed to see. Slowly, carefully, I unzipped the entrance, just enough to peer through the small opening. First, I saw nothing, just the rain, the mud, the endless tangle of trees. My fire pit had been drowned by the downpour, leaving only a circle of blackened stones. Then, in a flash of lightning, I saw it. A figure stood just beyond the reach of my tent, partially hidden by the trees. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. They weren't moving, just standing there watching. My stomach twisted. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but another flash of lightning came, and they were gone. I sat frozen, gripping the zipper of my tent like a lifeline. My mind raced, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe it was just my imagination, a trick of the light and shadows. Maybe it was another traveler, lost in the storm. But the silence in the jungle told me otherwise. I closed the tent, my hands shaking. I needed to leave. I wasn't sure where I would go, but staying here felt wrong. I started gathering my things, shoving supplies into my backpack with clumsy hands. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. Then, another sound. Not footsteps this time. Breathing. Close. Right outside my tent. My hands went still. The air was thick, heavy with rain and something else. A scent that wasn't the jungle, something metallic, something wrong. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just listened. Then, slowly, the breathing faded. The footsteps started again, moving away this time. I counted to 10, then 20, then 50. When I was sure they were gone, I moved. I grabbed my bag, unzipped the tent in one quick motion, and stepped into the rain. My boots sank into the mud, water soaking through my clothes in seconds. I scanned the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing, but the feeling didn't leave. I moved fast, barely stopping to break down my tent. I needed to put as much distance between myself and whatever had been outside as possible. I knew I wouldn't make it out of the rainforest that night, but I could find another spot, somewhere safer. I walked for what felt like hours, the rain never letting up. The jungle was alive again, but the sounds weren't comforting anymore. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch made my pulse jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure standing in the trees. I found a new spot eventually, deeper in the jungle, away from the river. I set up my tent again, though I didn't sleep. Morning came slow. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still a dull gray. The jungle smelled fresh, washed clean by the storm. I packed up as soon as there was enough light to see. I didn't want to stay any longer. As I made my way back toward the river, I looked for any signs of what had been there last night. I found them, footprints, deep in the mud, leading from where my tent had been back into the trees. But they weren't barefoot. They weren't from some lost traveler. They were boots, big ones, too big. I didn't stay to think about it. I just walked faster, pushing through the jungle, past the river, past the trees until I was out. I never went back. I always liked camping alone. It gave me a break from the noise of the world. No phones buzzing, no traffic, no people crowding the streets. Just me, the woods, and the sound of the wind pushing through the trees. I had been doing it for years, picking spots that were far from any towns or highways. I liked the feeling of isolation. This trip was no different. I had picked a spot deep in the woods of northern Montana, miles from any major road. It was late September, right before the deep cold of fall really set in. The air was crisp, and the trees were starting to shed their leaves. The smell of damp earth mixed with the scent of pine, the kind of smell that always made me feel calm. I drove out early in the morning, making sure to stop in a small town for last-minute supplies. I filled up my truck, grabbed some extra food, and checked my gear. I had my tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold weather, a few knives, a hatchet, a rifle, and enough food and water for a few days. I had been camping enough to know what I needed. By midday, I reached the turnoff that led to the dirt roads. The drive was rough, the road uneven and narrow, with overgrown branches scraping against the sides of my truck. It took me nearly an hour to get to the spot I had marked on my map. It was a clearing near a slow-moving river, surrounded by dense trees on all sides. No sign of people. Perfect. I set up my tent near the tree line, close enough to have some cover but far enough that I had a clear view of my surroundings. I built a fire pit with stones and collected some dry wood. The sky had started to darken, the sun dipping below the treetops. The air got colder. I zipped up my jacket and sat by the fire, eating a quick meal. The first night was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. I heard an owl hooting somewhere in the distance and the occasional rustling of leaves from a small animal. I was used to those sounds. I fell asleep fast, wrapped up in my sleeping bag inside the tent. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. The fire had burned down to embers. My breath was visible in the cold air. and then I heard it, twigs snapping. First, I thought it was a deer. They were common in these parts, and sometimes they wandered close to campsites. I listened for a moment, waiting for the sound of hooves moving through the brush, but there was nothing, just silence. I sat up, reaching for the rifle I had kept beside me. My pulse had quickened, but I told myself it was nothing, just the wind or a small animal. But then I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, not an animal. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound was coming from the trees to my right, maybe 20 or 30 feet away. I grabbed my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it toward the trees. Nothing, just empty woods, shadows stretching out between the trees. I stayed like that for a long time, my flashlight scanning the darkness. Eventually, I convinced myself it had just been my imagination. Maybe a branch had fallen. Maybe I was just on edge from being alone out here. I lay back down, gripping the rifle a little tighter. Took a long time before I fell asleep again. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent and stretched, the cold morning air biting at my skin. The fire was out, just a pile of ashes and half-burned logs. I walked around my campsite, checking for any signs of animals. But what I found made my stomach drop. Footprints, not mine. They were faint, but they were there, pressed into the dirt near the trees where I had heard the noises. They led deeper into the woods, disappearing into the undergrowth. I felt my skin go cold. I wasn't alone out here. I looked around, scanning the tree line. The feeling of being watched was heavy now, pressing down on me like a weight. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe another camper had passed through. Maybe it was just an old trail. But deep down, I knew better. Still, I forced myself to go about my day. I collected more firewood, cooked a small breakfast, and tried to enjoy the silence. But the feeling never left. That night, I made sure to keep my rifle loaded and my flashlight close. I stayed up late, listening, waiting, and then it happened again. Footsteps, closer this time. I sat up slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The fire was still burning, casting a faint glow around the campsite. I grabbed my flashlight, turned it on, and aimed it toward the trees. A figure, standing just at the edge of the light. I froze. It was a man, tall, thin, dressed in dark clothes. He didn't move, just stood there, half hidden in the trees, watching me. I gripped the rifle tighter. My mind raced. Who was he? What did he want? I didn't say anything, didn't make a sound. Then, as quickly as he had appeared, he stepped back into the darkness and was gone. I didn't sleep that night. The first light, I packed my gear. I didn't care about breakfast, didn't care about anything except getting out. My hands were shaking as I loaded everything into my truck. As I was about to leave, I looked back toward the woods one last time. And there, at the tree line, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. A pile of rocks, stacked neatly, deliberately, like a marker, like a warning. I got in my truck and drove. Fast. I didn't stop until I reached the highway, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I never went back to that spot, never camped alone again. And every now and then, when I close my eyes at night, I still see him, standing at the edge of the trees, watching, waiting. I had always loved camping. Something about being out in the wilderness, away from the noise of the city, made me feel more like myself. There was no traffic, no people constantly moving around, no distractions. Just me, the open sky, and the quiet hum of nature. It was late September, and I had taken a few days off work to head into the mountains alone. I had done this trip before, but something about this particular outing felt different. Maybe it was the time of year, summer had just ended, and the trails were empty, or maybe it was just the feeling in the air. The temperature had dropped overnight, and there was a damp chill in the wind that made my skin prickle. I had packed everything I needed: a tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a knife, and my old hunting rifle. I wasn't planning to hunt, but out in the wild, you never knew what you might run into. The area I was heading to wasn't exactly remote, but it was far enough that I wouldn't see many people. The trail was a few miles long, leading to a clearing near a small lake where I had camped before. I liked that spot because it was quiet. No noisy campers, no tourists, just me and the forest. The hike in was uneventful. I followed the trail for about 3 hours, the weight of my pack pressing against my shoulders, my boots crunching against the dirt. The trees were tall and thick, casting long shadows over the path as the sun started dipping lower in the sky. The air smelled like damp earth and pine. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was just starting to set. The lake stretched out in front of me, dark and still, reflecting the trees around it. I set my pack down and got to work setting up my tent. It didn't take long. I had done this enough times that it was second nature. Once everything was ready, I started a fire. The night air settled in fast. I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal of canned beans and jerky, listening to the sounds of the forest. The usual noises were there: the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves as the wind passed through, the occasional splash from the lake as some fish moved beneath the surface. But something felt off. It was a strange sensation, like I wasn't alone. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the woods, but there was nothing, just darkness. The fire crackled in front of me, the warmth pushing against my face, but the feeling didn't go away. I told myself it was just my imagination. I had been out here alone plenty of times before. Maybe it was just the season, the way the cold made everything feel emptier, lonelier. I finished eating and put the fire out before heading into my tent. It was quiet inside, the only sound my own breathing. I zipped up my sleeping bag and closed my eyes, listening to the forest. At some point, I must have fallen asleep. I woke up to a sound. At first, I thought I had imagined it, but then I heard it again. Something moving outside my tent. It wasn't the wind. It was footsteps, slow and deliberate. My stomach tightened. I held my breath, listening. The sound stopped. I stayed still, waiting. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. A deer? A bear? No, the steps had been too precise, too careful. I reached for my knife, my fingers wrapping around the handle. The footsteps started again, circling my tent. I stayed as quiet as I could, every muscle in my body tense. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and fast. The sound of the steps moved from one side of the tent to the other, pausing every few seconds. Then silence. I didn't move. I waited, straining to hear anything over the sound of my own breathing. Minutes passed. Nothing. Slowly, I exhaled. Maybe it had been an animal after all. I tried to calm myself, tried to tell myself that everything was fine. I stayed awake for a while, listening, but the footsteps didn't return. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent, my body stiff from the cold. The fire pit was undisturbed. Everything looked normal, but then I saw them, footprints in the dirt. They weren't mine. They circled my tent, moving carefully around it. The prints were deep, like whoever or whatever had made them had been standing there for a long time, watching. A chill ran down my spine. I crouched down, looking closer. The prints led back into the trees, disappearing into the underbrush. I stood up, scanning the tree line, but there was nothing, just empty woods. I had two options. I could pack up and leave, or I could stay. I chose to stay. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the fact that I didn't want to let fear dictate my decisions. Whatever the reason, I decided to stick to my plan. I spent the day fishing by the lake, keeping my rifle close. The air was cold, the water colder, but I managed to catch a few decent-sized fish. I cooked them over the fire as the sun started to set, the smell filling the air. For a while, everything felt normal again, but as the darkness settled in, that feeling returned. I felt exposed, like I was being watched. I scanned the tree-line, my fingers tightening around my knife. Nothing moved, but the feeling didn't go away. I ate quickly and put the fire out, retreating into my tent. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay there listening, and then footsteps, slow, careful, closer this time. Something brushed against the side of my tent. I didn't move. The fabric shifted slightly, like someone had pressed their hand against it. I gripped my knife tighter, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the presence was gone. Morning came and I stepped outside to find the same footprints, deeper this time. They led toward the trees, but this time they didn't disappear. I followed them. They went deeper into the forest, weaving between trees. I moved carefully, my rifle in hand. Then I saw it. A small clearing, pile of bones picked clean. Animal bones, but arranged in a pattern almost deliberate. And beside them, something else. A jacket. It was old, faded, and it hadn't been there for long. I turned and walked back to camp. Fast. I packed up my gear, my hands shaking. I didn't run. I didn't want to, but I moved quickly. I left the campsite, following the trail back. Every so often, I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. By the time I reached my truck, the sun was high in the sky. I threw my gear in the back, got in, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the road, I saw something in my rearview mirror. A figure standing at the tree line, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I just kept driving. I never went back to that spot, and I never camped alone again. I never liked camping alone, but I did it anyway. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe I just wanted to prove something to myself. Whatever the reason, that trip into the woods of northern Montana in the summer of 2017 was the last time I ever went camping by myself. I had picked a remote spot, about 15 miles off the nearest paved road. The area was mostly untouched. A thick forest of pines and spruces stretching endlessly in every direction. It was the kind of place where you could go days without seeing another person, which was exactly what I was looking for. No noise, no distractions. Just me, my gear, and the quiet wilderness. I had a truck with a camper shell, but I preferred to sleep outside. There was something about being under the stars, feeling the night air on my face, that made the trip feel more real. The first 2 nights were uneventful. I spent my days hiking, fishing, and enjoying the isolation. At night, I'd sit by the fire and listen to the sounds of the woods, the distant calls of owls, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was peaceful in a way that's hard to find in everyday life. The third night is when things changed. I had just finished eating, cleaned up my campsite, and settled into my sleeping bag near the fire. The night was unusually quiet. Normally, I could hear the sounds of insects and night birds, but it was like everything had gone still. The only sound was the occasional crackle of my fire. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was nothing. I wasn't new to camping. I knew that sometimes the woods just got quiet for no reason. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then I heard it, a single, deliberate snap of a twig. It was close, too close. Not the kind of sound a small animal makes when it's scurrying around. It was the sound of something heavy, something careful, stepping in the woods just beyond the reach of my firelight. I turned my head slowly, scanning the darkness. My fire cast long, flickering shadows on the trees, but beyond that, it was nothing but blackness. My heartbeat picked up. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe an elk, but something about it felt wrong. Then another step, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it in the direction of the noise. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and bushes. No movement, no glowing eyes reflecting back at me, but I knew something was there. I sat up, my skin crawling. I listened hard, trying to hear past the ringing in my own ears. I could feel my pulse in my throat. A full minute passed, then another. No more sounds. After a while, I forced myself to lie back down. Maybe it was just my nerves. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But just as I was starting to relax, I heard it again. A step, then another. Slow, steady, deliberate. Someone was out there. I grabbed my knife and sat up again, scanning the darkness. My truck was about 30 feet away, parked just outside the ring of light from the fire. I considered moving to it, locking myself inside. But something told me not to move, to stay quiet. Then I saw it. A shape, barely visible between the trees. A dark outline, standing just beyond the fire's glow. My blood went cold. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. I couldn't see their face, couldn't make out any details, but they were standing there, just watching me. I gripped my knife tighter, my mind racing. Who the hell was out here? I was miles from the nearest road, from the nearest town. Nobody should have been out here. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there. I stared at it, trying to decide what to do. Should I call out? Demand to know who they were? I didn't want to give away that I was scared. I didn't want to give them any reason to think I was weak. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stepped back into the darkness and was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I kept my fire going, my knife in my hand, and my back to my truck. Every few minutes, I'd scan the trees, looking for any sign of movement, but I saw nothing. By morning, I had convinced myself that I imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was a trick of the firelight, a shadow that looked like a person. Maybe I was just exhausted, my mind playing games with me. I packed up my camp, ready to head home. As I loaded my gear into the truck, I noticed something. Footprints. Clear, deep footprints in the dirt near the edge of my campsite. They were fresh, and they weren't mine. I felt my stomach drop. Someone had been there, watching me. I drove out of those woods faster than I ever had before. I don't camp alone anymore. I don't know who was out there that night or what they wanted. But I do know one thing. When the woods go silent, when the air feels wrong, when something inside you tells you that you're not alone, you should listen, because sometimes you aren't.